Oh, turn my video on. There you go.
Yes, I believe so. I think I've spelled it before, and I just sent it back that this is generating.
Maroon, can you turn your camera on?
Good morning. I will now call the May 7th, 2024 Committee of the Whole meeting to order. The time is 11 a.m. I would like to acknowledge that the City of Maple Ridge carries out its business on the traditional unceded territory of the Katzie First Nation and the Kwantlen First Nation. We will move over to our CAO for an announcement.
Good morning, Mayor and Council and members of the public. I just wanted to acknowledge Stephen Faltis sitting in the staff area today. Stephen's our new Director of Engineering, joined us yesterday. So we're pleased to welcome Stephen to the Corporation of Maple Ridge. Stephen has a mechanical engineering degree with a master's in business administration. He spent time in Oakville, Ontario, as well as Edmonton, Alberta, before settling in the Lower Mainland. He's held key positions in both public and private sectors, most recently with the City of New Westminster as their Senior Manager, Deputy Director of their Energy and Climate Action Department. His leadership was pivotal in the successful execution of several landmark projects, including 2 solar garden projects, as well as a recently energized substation. Stephen's strategic mindset, coupled with a keen understanding of the challenges faced by modern municipalities, positions as well to lead our city's engineering department. I know he's excited to join the City of Maple Ridge, and we're excited to have him here. So on behalf of Corporation, Mayor and Council, Stephen Faltis, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Hartman, and welcome. We are happy that you're here, and thank you for joining us this morning. Madam Clerk, can you give us the overview of the procedures for this meeting, please?
Thank you. Good morning. This meeting is being live streamed and recorded and will be available to the public for playback on our website in accordance with Council Policy 3.12. Committee of the Whole is the initial venue for Council review of information to ensure that Council can debate and vote on issues at a future Council meeting. No voting takes place on bylaws or resolutions during Committee of the Whole. For voting purposes, Council has been provided with voting cards, green for in favor, red for opposed, and yellow for point of order. For members of the public who would like to speak, an opportunity will be available later in the meeting during our community forum.
Thank you very much. Okay, can I get a motion to approve the agenda as circulated, please? Moved by Councillor Carreras, seconded by Councillor Dewick. All those in favor? Any opposed? The motion is carried. Okay, next we have the minutes of the Committee of the Whole meeting of April 16th, 2024. Are there any amendments to the minutes? Seeing none, may I please have a motion to adopt the minutes as circulated? Moved by Mayor Rumi, seconded by Councillor Tan. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried.
The next item on the agenda is item 7.1, the 2023 consolidated financial statements. Staff are in attendance to present this item.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you. So here today to walk you through the financial results for 2023. So very much a focus on the past with this presentation. Your recent discussions have all been focused on the future, what you want to do, how you're going to get there. This is very much just a focus backwards, more of a history lesson than anything else. So the 2023 consolidated financial statements, they report the results of operations for the city as a whole as compared to the adopted budget and as compared to the prior year. So this is a little bit different than a lot of the financial information you see. Often it's focused on just discrete portions of the organization. This looks at the entire organization. The content and format of the statements is driven by public sector accounting guidelines. There were 5 new ones in 2023. They were not all fun, but we will go through those in just a moment. And our financial statements are audited annually. So every year there is a very thorough process to ensure that the numbers we are reporting are free from material misstatement. So I talked about there were 5 new accounting standards. So the first one that we'll talk about is something called asset retirement obligations. And this one required us to take a look at all of our assets, whether we own them or lease them, and determine whether there are things that we must do when we take them out of service. And it required us to record a liability associated with that. So this required us to look at all of our buildings that were constructed prior to a certain date to see if there was asbestos in them. We know there's a legal obligation to address asbestos in a specific way. We had to record a liability associated with that. Wells was another one. There is a specific requirement to decommission them. So we had to record a liability for that. We have one piece of land that we lease. It's used as the commuter lot. At the end of that lease, we were required to take our stuff off of that property. So there was a liability for that. The big one though was the landfill. There is a lot of legislation that talks about how we need to close a landfill. There's a lot of very specific activities that are set out in legislation, and then we need to monitor that site for some time. That is the biggest portion of this new liability. And if things go forward on the timeline that we currently think they will, it will be 2055 before this liability is extinguished. So it's a very long-lived one. The next one we had was portfolio investments. This just guides the way we account for the investments holdings that the city has. Not much there, except that it linked to this one, financial instruments. So what this required us to do was take a look at certain of our portfolio investments where the returns that we earn on them are linked to other things. So we have some where the returns are linked to, like, I believe it's the Canadian Bankers Acceptance Index. So because of that linkage, they get classified as a portfolio investment with a derivative, and we are now required to report those at market value at the end of the year. So wherever there is a difference between the cost of that investment and the resulting market value, that results in either a reported gain or a reported loss. Got nothing to do with cash. It's just the difference between the cost and the market value on December 31st. And with all of those, there was a new standard that guides the way our financial statements look. So there is a new statement introduced this year, and some of the elements of the statements, they've changed a little bit. And the last one, which was really easy because we didn't have to do anything with it, was foreign currency translation. So this just guides how we would have to account for anything that was denominated in a foreign currency. A long time ago, we did have some debt that was denominated in US currency, so that would have fallen under this. We don't currently. We don't anticipate this one having an impact on us in the future. So with that, we'll start to look at the statements themselves, starting with the statement of financial position. And I just want to refresh a little bit what some of those key terms mean on here. The first one being net financial position. This is kind of a unique indicator to the public sector, and it's just our financial assets, which are things like cash, things like accounts receivable, less our liabilities. So everything we owe, whether that's accounts payable that will be settled in the near term or those longer term horizon or longer term liabilities like those asset retirement obligations. The result of that is our net financial position. If it is positive, it's referred to as net assets. If it's negative, it's net debt. And it's just intended to provide an indication of the extent to which future revenues are going to be needed to satisfy the liabilities that we have today. It does not factor in any of our non-financial resources, things like our tangible capital assets. Those are the physical things that we use to deliver services. Next one on here is accumulated surplus. And this is one of the things that's changed a little bit this year. So it takes our net financial position and adds to it our non-financial assets. It's intended to be an indicator of net and economic resources available for service provision. It's not a funding source for day-to-day operations, but what has changed this year is it's now comprised of the accumulated operating surplus, so our revenues and expenses, net of that accumulated remeasurement loss or gain. So a little bit of a different approach to this one. So with that, we'll take a look at the statement of financial position itself. You'll see there are financial assets at the top of the statement. Behind most of them is a note reference to a note. So if you wanted more information about that particular item, you could go to the notes section of the financial statements and find that. Underneath that is our liabilities. And then you see our net financial assets, the non-financial assets, and then that accumulated surplus. So before I move on, I want to just take a moment just to talk about the relationship between some of these items here, and in particular, restricted revenue. Restricted revenue is where we record development cost charges when we collect them. When we collect things like development cost charges, there are projects set out in a DCC bylaw that we are obligated to deliver to people. So until we actually deliver those projects, this actually gets recorded as a liability. It's only when we undertake those projects that we then draw down that liability and recognize revenue. So on this page where you see restricted revenue, that's monies we've collected but not yet invested in infrastructure. They're also going to sit in our cash and investment balance. So moving on from there, I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of that asset retirement obligation. You see there those buildings, we've got a little bit of a liability there. The leasehold obligation we talked about, insignificant wells also, it's the landfill that's the big one. This is a significant change from our estimations last year. We actually had a consultant come in and go through all of the activities that are required and give us updated costs. And these reflect the time value of money. So as we get closer to the time when these liabilities are going to be extinguished, you'll actually see this number go up. As we undertake the works that are required, it'll come down as a result of that. But over time, it's always going to reflect the time value of money. And focus a little bit on accumulated surplus here. We've changed the way we present it a little bit just because of these new liabilities being so large. We've now, in note 15 to the financial statements, we've broken out surplus. So we still have the operating surplus, the reserves, the equity and capital, the remeasurement loss is shown in here now, but where we have future obligations, especially those ones that are going to be settled over a longer time horizon, we've shown that separately now, because otherwise it just makes the balances in the revenue funds look negative when that's not necessarily the case. So those future obligations include employee future obligations, debt, and that asset retirement obligation. So the graph on the right of the slide there is the operating surplus in the utilities and the general revenue fund. And you can see there we ended the year with accumulated surplus in the general revenue fund of about 7.6 million. So when we discussed this at the audit committee yesterday, it was reflected that it would be useful to know how much of that was committed to things already. So roughly 2/3 of that amount is already committed to work that will be underway in 2024. So with that, we'll move on to the statement of operations. Again, a couple of key things here. Annual surplus is our revenues less our expenses, and it indicates whether the revenues recorded in the year were sufficient to cover those expenses. There's some nuances to this that once we actually look at the statement, I'll go through, because not all of our revenues equal cash. And then accumulated operating surplus, again, it's just that difference between revenues and expenses accumulated over time, and it does not consider the impact of that accumulated remeasurement gain or loss. So there is the statement of operations. You see there are revenues at the top, followed by expenses. Revenues are recorded by type. Expenses are recorded by the functional area of the organization where they were incurred. Then you see our annual surplus, and then that accumulated operating surplus. So a couple of things on the revenue that I want to touch on for you here. First one being government transfers. You can see that our 2023 actual grants were quite in excess of budget. The reason for that was the Growing Communities grant that we received of about 16.6 million. And you will recall that you passed a bylaw recently to create a reserve for that. So that money has been transferred into that reserve. And that was one of the stipulations in the grant agreement for that fund. Next one, we'll take a look at development revenue. You'll see that that's actually quite a bit below budget. Development revenue is primarily associated with the capital program. So where there are different timing differences in hoped for delivery and actual delivery of projects, we'll see a difference in this. We typically see this every year. This is also where we just talked about when we collect DCCs, we record them as restricted revenue. When we draw down that liability, this is where they'll be recognized. Interest and investment income, that again was in excess of budget. That's just a reflection of the rates that were available to us in the market. Contributed tangible capital assets. This is the fair value of the assets that were turned over to the city as a result of the development process. So this one in particular does not reflect any cash received. It's just the value associated with those assets that we received. On the expense side, all we see is the amortization entry or the use of those assets. So I think that was about 1.3 million for 2023. So that is one of those things that is a big contributor to the annual surplus. On the expense side, you'll see a couple of the reporting segments show as over budget. What that is related to is not any expenses that the city incurred, like the labor or anything like that. There was the estimate for amortization in the budget didn't reflect the actual amortization cost, so that wasn't a cash overage at all. And you see there are annual surplus of about 58 million and our accumulated operating surplus of 1.37. So next, this is the new statement for the year, the statement of remeasurement gains and losses. So again, this is the difference on December 31st between the cost of our investments. There were 9 of them that were caught up by this new standard and the fair value of them. So that results in a reported 1.3 remeasurement loss. Both legislation and our investment policy really focus on protecting the principal of our investments. So the likelihood of this loss actually being realized is very remote. Next is the statement of change in net financial assets. This just starts with our annual surplus, adjusts for non-cash item, and just shows you how that net financial asset number changed during the year. Lastly is the statement of cash flow. Again, it just shows how cash was used in the organization. The one number I'll draw your attention to here is the cash used to acquire tangible capital assets at 51.6 million. That's one of the highest numbers I've seen for quite some time. And so that represents a significant investment in the city's infrastructure. I think that's worth celebrating. One of the other schedules to the financial statements is something called the segment report. It's laid out in exactly the same way as the statement of operations, but it provides a little bit of a finer level of detail, attributes revenues and expenses to the functional areas where they were earned, and breaks those expenses down a little bit to give you a sense of what was spent on goods and services, labor and debt servicing, etc. So lastly, we'll touch on the reserves. Now we have 2 different types of reserves. We have reserve funds, which are statutory. Those are the reserves where you actually adopt a bylaw that sets out how those funds in that reserve are going to be used. And then we have reserve accounts, which are discretionary appropriations of surplus. So they're a little bit more flexible for us. This is just copied from note 16 to the financial statements. It shows you all of our reserves. You'll see there a new one for the Growing Communities Grant. That was the reserve fund that you established recently. We transferred those monies into that reserve fund along with interest that amount had earned. And on the reserve account side, we have a new one now for the landfill closure reserve, knowing that that one, and actually it isn't new, it has been around for a long time. We just didn't have any monies in it. Knowing that that particular process is going to require a lot of money, we did want to set some aside for it. So this is intended to go to council on May 14th, at which time we need the consolidated financial statements to be approved. That is a Canadian auditing standard requirement. Once we have that, the auditors can stop auditing and I can maybe celebrate New Year's. But so with that, thank you. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Sure. Okay, moved by Councillor Curris, seconded by Mayor Remy. Yes, questions? Nope. Okay, Catherine, I did have a question on the statement of operations. The amount there that's shown for development revenue, is that the DCC fees?
It is
essentially?
things like DCCs, community amenity charges, that sort of stuff. So they sit in restricted revenue. So the cash might have been received quite some time ago. So as the work that they were intended to do gets completed, we then recognize revenue.
When I was looking at the statement of operations, I could just see that there was a fairly significant difference between what we had forecasted for 2023 versus what the actual was. And there's obviously lots of factors for that. But it did just get me thinking about our process to raise our DCC fees. And I wondered if we could get an update from staff on where we are at with that process.
I will ask Mr. Thompson to give you an update.
Thank you. So the minor amendment has been in progress for quite some time. The bylaw currently sits at third reading. It went to the province for review, had some rework that was required. That rework has been done. We've got notice back from the ministry that with some conditions, they're willing to accept that amendment. So a report will be back in front of council shortly, spelling out exactly what those conditions are, a little bit of the disclosure piece, and then probably another bylaw shortly thereafter, once we receive the ministry approval. So it's in its final stretch.
Thank you very much. Okay, seeing no further questions, we'll call the vote. All those in favor? Oh, it's a question now. Sorry, Councillor Ferris.
No problem. Being chair of the audit and finance committee, I'm on, right? The audit and finance committee had the opportunity to ask lots of questions yesterday. But I just wanted to, if you could speak a little bit more, and we did ask this yesterday, but I think it's important for the rest of us because we rely on these numbers a lot when things are coming to us, which is number 10, the restricted revenues. If you can just speak a little bit to that and then explain what the 7.5 in other makes up. So we know it's restricted for something. So when it comes to us, what is it restricted for?
So note 10 to the financial statements, as Councillor Carreras pointed out, does refer to our restricted revenues. So included in that is our development cost charges, parkland acquisition charges, as well as our community amenity charges and the Albion amenity charges as well. The category of other, the primary component of that is something that we refer to as our in-trust reserve, which are monies collected as part of the development process for things like undergrounding our wires or stuff like that. That's the largest portion of that. And then there's just some other minor amounts in there.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, then I will call the question now. All those in favor of moving this to the next council meeting? Any opposed? That is carried. Thank you. Madam Clerk, what do we have next on the agenda?
Thank you. The next item is our community forum. Participants in the community forum are reminded that there should be no discussion of public hearing bylaws which have not yet reached conclusion. Each speaker will have 2 minutes to speak to council. A second opportunity may be provided once all speakers in the queue have had an opportunity to speak. The total time allotted for community forum is 15 minutes. If you wish to inquire about additional opportunities to address council, please contact the corporate officer. For members of the public who would like to speak during community forum, clearly state your name and city of residence before beginning your comments. And for those participating electronically, please use the raise hand icon. When you are called upon, please turn on your camera. If you are attending the meeting in person, please come forward to the podium when the chair invites speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone from the public wish to address council? Do we have anyone online? No. Okay, not seeing any speakers, we will move on to the next item on the agenda.
Thank you. The next item on today's agenda is item 11 to provide notice of closed meeting. The motion is on the screen.
Thank you. So we have the motion here to go into a closed meeting. May I have a motion, please? Moved by Councillor Carreras, seconded by Mayor Rumi. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? And that is passed, and we are moving into closed. Thank you.